Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ISPE's quarterly webinar program. I appreciate your patience. We're currently trying to pull up the slides on our screen. Today's program is Understanding Cyber Threats from a Hacker's Perspective. How exposed is your business? I'm going to go through a few housekeeping pointers today. All attendees have been automatically muted to avoid audio feedback issues. All questions are going to be held until the end of the presentation. If you do have a question, please go ahead and type it into the question box in your toolbar. And you are eligible to earn your PDHs by logging into this session for its duration. You'll receive an email shortly after this, after the webinar ends, with your certificate. We'll be keeping attendee files on record for auditing purposes. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Leanne Nicolo and John Keebler from Coalition Incorporated as our presenters today.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is John Keebler. I hope that everyone can hear me okay and that you can see the slides that Leanne's presenting. I'm on the business development team at Coalition. We're an insurtech that was founded in 2017. For those of you not familiar with Coalition, we're the fastest growing provider of cyber insurance in the US and now Canada. One of the things that makes us so unique in the marketplace is the number of proactive security measures that we offer our policyholders to help manage their cyber risk. And we also have an in-house response team that is comprised of IT security professionals that work with our insureds to help mitigate cyber incidents when they occur. I've been in the insurance industry for about 15 years now, 10 of which have been on the cyber side. I think one of the interesting things about that journey is just kind of, the changing landscape that I've seen and the market has seen over the last 10 years regarding, the types of claims and the sophistication of the types of attacks that are going on out in the marketplace. And that's really kind of what the point of, our presentation is here today. We're here to talk about some best practices for cybersecurity, help you understand where breaches and attacks are actually occurring, and what we can all do to help keep ourselves safer and protect our businesses. Obviously, this is a hot button topic right now, and it's something that businesses of all sizes are exposed to. The number of breaches and ransomware attacks and social engineering attacks only continues to grow annually. And again, it's something that no business is immune to. I think one of the great kind of fallacies is this notion that only big companies like Equifax have to worry about bad actors getting on their network, and that's just simply not true. I mean, the last data point that we have is that about 43% of all attacks are targeted towards small businesses. I would venture that in the wake of 2020, that number is going to be much higher once kind of that information is aggregated. And so, we'll be covering a wide range of topics today, from, remote access, which is obviously a hot button item in light of the fact that everyone's working from home, or many people are working from home in the COVID world. And, some best practices around password use and, just a litany of other security topics. So, hopefully everyone walks away with some things to think about and a better sense of the sort of policies and protocols they should have in place to help button up your cyber posture. As it was mentioned, we're going to be giving time at the end of the presentation for questions, so don't worry, we'll have an open forum for that at the end. With that said, let's just kind of jump in and get started. I'm very excited to be joined today by my colleague Leanne. She's a member of our security team. So I'll pass the spotlight over to you, allow her to kind of introduce herself, walk through her background, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Go ahead, Leanne.
Awesome, thanks, John. So like John mentioned, my name is Leanne Nicolo. I help lead our Coalition Incident Response team. So prior to joining Coalition, I've been in the kind of consulting world, helping government and private entities kind of secure their business and do proactive as well as reactive security offerings. At Coalition, we do more of the same, but we're primarily focused on reactive. So we are helping our policyholders, once they face an incident, get through it, So most commonly, we're seeing business email compromise as well as ransomware events. I have been with Coalition for 2 years now, and it has definitely been quite the ride, especially in 2020 with the ever-growing kind of attack surface just getting worse with everybody working from home. So definitely been a lot of work, and we are hopeful that you take out kind of these key areas of security from this presentation today. We totally understand that every organization has different needs, but today we're going to provide kind of the best measures to take on prevention. So this is just preventing attacks overall without knowing anything specific about your environment. So we'll just jump right in here. So the 9 key areas we're going to focus on is remote access, software, accounts and data, email, backups, logging, passwords, the network, and systems. You'll notice the ones with the star may be a little bit more technical. So we have a guide that we can pass along after this to kind of delve into with your IT team. And then if anybody has any questions at any time, feel free to throw them in the chat. We can address those at the end. So assuming a few things here, we are making the assumption that you are running a Windows environment, which is upwards of 95% of our policyholders. You do have an Active Directory domain. You have an internal or external IT team, so some sort of support that understands computers and could help you through, assuming you were ever to face an incident or any sort of compromise. And then you have hosted email. So you're using an email through a third party, whether that's Office 365 or Gmail. Those are the 2 most common that we see. So remote access, this has been a big topic, especially since the coronavirus pandemic. Everybody started working from home and people just turned on RDP since that was, by default included in these Windows networks. Obviously, if it's as easy as you to remote in and connect to your systems from home, it's just as easy for a bad actor. So RDP is a big one. We are seeing crazy numbers in terms of scanning on the internet for open RDP. And then all the attackers have to do is kind of set it and forget it with a brute force attack. So they'll guess username and passwords, and then once they get a hit, they're in. So very, very simple from an attack perspective. Very, very dangerous and also relatively simple to secure. We recommend disabling remote desktop completely. That's the default port of 3389, just turning it off on the firewall and utilizing a third-party tool that is not RDP. So we listed some here. My favorite is Screen Connect, but LogMeIn, Kaseya, TeamViewer, they all work well. And then the caveat there is to add a second layer of authentication, so 2FA or MFA, to these third-party tools. That way, if an attacker does guess your password, they can't get in. Alternatively, if you would like to keep RDP, we'd suggest putting it behind a VPN, so a virtual private network that has that multi-factor authentication layer in place. So these are some kind of statistics in terms of remote access that's consolidated. Every 39 seconds, we're seeing attackers launch new cyber attacks against small businesses. Greater than 50% of our claims are coming from remote access, so really hot number there. And I think this has actually increased since these slides were put together recently, but we're seeing about 86 million scans within 24 hours where attackers are looking for open RDP. So it's extremely targeted. So I touched on a little bit, but the risks of remote access, brute force. So attackers are just guessing passwords and usernames. It's a very simple attack for them to kind of set up and walk away from the computer and get alerted once they've gotten a hit. And then protocol exploit. So they'll find vulnerable remote access software on the internet and utilize that to connect to your networks. Usually we see data exfiltration and then ultimately a ransomware attack after these remote connections are successful. So we recommend disabling any remote connections that are not absolutely necessary. The ones that are necessary, we recommend enabling that multi-factor authentication, also known as 2FA, on all accounts using. So we've had policyholders contact in the past and say, you know, we have MFA, but it's just on the admin accounts. That really does no good. Often we see attackers taking advantage of service accounts. So we've seen, you know, accounts or test accounts is another good example. So if there's an account called test in the environment, or, you know, SQL service or whatever it is, and it's part of the domain, so it has remote access, it's just included on that list of users through, you know, group policy or Active Directory or whatever is the case. The password was probably set a few years ago, very, very easy to guess. And then that's the account that the attacker is potentially exploiting just due to the weak password, or, you know, once they are in the network, if they can tell that the account has not been used for a while. So it's very important to put MFA on all the accounts. It doesn't help to just put them on a handful. The second bullet is disable any ports that are not being utilized. Most of our policyholders, I would say, have the kind of thought that I will leave it all wide open and then just lock down what I know is bad. We suggest the opposite. We'll lock down everything and then just open what you actually need. So that's a little bit of a better approach to security. Going to get into software now. Highly recommend to keep all of the software within your network up to date. Make sure you're following regular patching schedules. Use an antivirus software on all systems. Ensure that this AV is up to date with the latest threat definitions. Another big thing here is to make sure you're setting up alerting to where if this antivirus is disabled on any endpoint, that the administrator receives an alert. Often we see the first thing that the attackers do is go in and disable AV. So if the AV is there and you're not aware that it is being disabled, you know, that does no good for the administrator, because they just don't know that's happening. So definitely set up those alerts. SMB version 1, we don't have to really get into that today, but it's kind of a legacy protocol that we recommend disabling it. We've seen a lot of attackers exploit the vulnerability of it in spreading ransomware throughout a network. Accounts and data. So older data that contains sensitive information should be backed up and stored offline. So if it's not currently being accessed, you know, daily, weekly, whatever the case is, we recommend not keeping it on the network. Often we see attackers connect to a domain, and the first thing they'll do is search for this data, because they know they can kind of hold it over your head in terms of once it's exfiltrated, that they now have a reason to threaten you with producing this data on the internet. Minimize the utilization of local and domain administrator accounts. Often we see an IT team that, you know, each individual person has their own domain admin account, 6, 7, 8, 9 accounts throughout the network. We recommend having one with a very, very strong password and multi-factor authentication enabled on it, and then audit it every now and then. You know, whether that's weekly or monthly, make sure that there's no suspicious logins or activity with that account. That is how we say, you know, keys to the kingdom if somebody were to get the domain admin credentials. And then confirm that end users are not local administrators on their system. Often we have these users, a lot of people are set up as local administrators just so they can install their own software, and, you know, they don't need to go to IT for every little thing. But this gives way to installing malicious programs where we see a lot of malware coming, you know, just from the wide open internet. So definitely disable that access if you are able. Email is arguably the most important, just because we see this so much. Just 35% of our claims are resulting from business email compromise. And companies using Microsoft email are 3 times more likely to experience a funds transfer fraud claim. I would argue that the most important takeaway from today is 2, maybe. It is disabling remote access or locking down remote access, and then training employees on phishing emails. we are seeing a constant just uptick. It really hasn't let off in the past few years of phishing emails that come in with malicious documents as attachments. So these maldocs are attempting to look like invoices or newsletters, and when the end user opens them, they install a backdoor into the network. They're very stealthy. They evade antivirus detection, and as an end user, you really wouldn't notice anything is going on. But this connection actually gives way to the attacker into the network. So they now have control whether they want to exfiltrate data or, set a ransomware attack. Whatever the case is, they'll have full control once they get that piece of software in the network. So the biggest thing is do not open suspicious email. So if you have any attachments or links that may look odd or you're not expecting it, forward it along to the IT team. Just do not open it on the network. Do not click. Do not enter credentials. If you see something, say something. The biggest thing is to train employees on these phishing tactics, as they're always, changing. At the beginning of COVID, we saw a mass email campaign where they were sending COVID newsletters, but they had a piece of malware in them. So as soon as you open the newsletter, which is a PDF attachment, they now had a hook into the system. So they're definitely with the times and constantly updating and upgrading how they're sending these pieces of malware to the networks. We offer curricula through our coalition policyholder dashboard. So we offer free training, which is for phishing training for up to 15 employees through that. And then implement an email hygiene service. So these are things such as Mimecast to prevent these phishing emails from even hitting the end users. Be aware of emails which require a login after a link. So often you'll notice, if you've ever seen a phishing link, that the page goes to Google or Apple, Dropbox, Office 365, whatever it is, and it asks you to sign in. If you were to look at the URL, it would not be www.office.com or any of these legitimate websites. Often they take advantage of a compromised website, and so the URL will look off. But that is difficult for an end user to really notice. So if it is prompting you for a password, recommend kind of Xing it out, going back to your web page, logging into the legitimate site, and then seeing if there's anything waiting for you there, whether it's a document or any prompt for you to move forward. If a suspicious email is received, we always recommend following up with a phone call. So if that sender is somebody that you are aware of and they're sending you something that looks a little odd, just call their number that you have already on file. Don't take it from their signature if you can avoid that. We have seen malicious actors change the signatures or the phone numbers and signatures rather by one digit, and then they'll actually answer the phone, or they hire people to answer the phone and confirm everything looks good. So always utilize a known good phone number for the accounts if possible. Backups. So backups are a big one. Making sure you're testing the backups to confirm that they're working and that they're restoring correctly. Keep multiple iterations of the backup. We recommend utilizing a hybrid environment. So cloud backups, are great, but also utilizing backups that are totally offline or off-site. So if there were to be a ransomware event, how quickly can you restore? So often we have clients that say, I have great backups. And we're like, okay, when's the last time you tested them? And they'll take a look at them and they'll realize that they haven't been working the past 6-7 months. And for a company that does manufacturing, say 6-7 months is a very long time to not have data for. So then they may be stuck potentially paying a ransom because their backup data is so outdated. So making sure you're testing them and that all the data is really off the network, because attackers, that's one of the first things that they look for. We see once they're in the network that they're searching for backups so that they could corrupt them or encrypt them or ultimately delete them if they can't do anything else. Enabling volume shadow copies. So that's something within a Windows environment that is also really good to enable. It's basically a backup at a per file level. And then utilize different username and password combinations that are not associated with your domain to log into any of the backup portals. So if an attacker is able to steal the credentials for your administrator account, make sure those aren't the same credentials utilized to access your backup software. Logging. So enable logging for all services that support it. This really helps during the recovery phase to make sure that you can prevent any sort of attack so that you can understand, how it happened the first time. Logging is key to kind of create this story. Store logs in a central location. We recommend taking it off a network, that is not associated with production if possible. We also recommend reviewing the logs regularly. So making sure that you can determine any suspicious activity within the network from these logs that you have aggregated. Passwords. So on average, we see 95 passwords found in our security scans. I'm not sure exactly what the time frame of that is, but often we see passwords in, I would say, 60 or 70% of our cases that Coalition Incident Response handles. We are able to find some sort of, it's usually a third-party breach. So in the case where a client has employees that utilize their business email for LinkedIn and Zappos and their personal AOL and whatever they do in their personal life, they're utilizing not only their business email, but the same password, which is a huge security risk because when those third parties potentially get breached, then your company doesn't have to do anything. In terms of security, you're going to be potentially breached by default because the attacker then pivots over by publicly available information. So they're hopping on LinkedIn, they're seeing where this employee works, they're going to www.office.com and gmail.com and trying these combinations. You'd be very surprised how often they get a hit from those types of pivoting. So definitely recommend implementing some sort of policy where employees cannot use their business emails for personal use, and then really suggesting kind of no password reuse whatsoever. So to get to that kind of gold standard, we recommend adopting a password guideline. The NIST framework outlines a really good suggestion for passwords. We tend to defer to them in terms of passphrases and length. Passphrases was adopted a few years ago in terms of complexity. The longer the password, the harder it is to guess. So a phrase rather than just a specific word. Implementing account lockouts is another big one. So lock out the accounts after 5 failed password attempts, and then remain locked until a request for a password reset is requested by the end user. This stops brute force attack where the attacker just kind of sets and forgets the attack to guess hundreds, thousands, millions of passwords to where they'll get locked out after 5. Moving to the network. So enable geolocation IP blocking of ranges in countries that should not be accessing the network. I would say upwards of 80% of our business email compromises, the end IP is coming from Nigeria or the Netherlands. We see a lot of ransomware coming from Russian and Ukrainian IP addresses. If you're not doing work in those countries, we definitely recommend kind of just blanket blocking the IP ranges. That would help prevent a lot of these access that you're not potentially aware of just by location. And then research HIPS and IDS systems. This stands for Host Intrusion Prevention and Intrusion Detection Systems. These sit on the network, so if you have any suspicious connections or activity, they send really good alerts to kind of make you aware of what is going on the perimeter. Okay, moving on to system. So this is a big one. This goes back to the malicious attachments that we spoke about. Often these attachments will prompt you to enable macros or VBA scripts. These are how the malware payload comes in through the attachment. So if you do not utilize them in your environment, we recommend disabling them completely. And then often we see ransomware. I mentioned SMB version 1. We also see ransomware kind of running rampant through the network, not only utilizing the default RDP internally, but PowerShell is a big one. If you do not need PowerShell on the endpoints, we highly recommend disabling it completely from running on the endpoints. This will kind of stop ransomware in its tracks if it is utilizing ransomware, PowerShell rather, to propagate throughout the network. Okay, excellent. So went through that kind of fast. Does anybody have any questions? John, I'm not sure if you can see the questions.
Yeah, actually, and I was hoping, considering that, this is such a dynamic space, right? As far as, how quickly breaches, change. I was hoping you could and you're very much on the front lines of what we see at Coalition, right? Is there any, 2 or 3 kind of common trends that you're seeing in the last, 6 to 12 months, about, maybe new things that we're seeing from a claim standpoint, or, new types of attacks, or really things that are kind of like more like, front page, breaking news kind of things? Is there anything you can speak to around that?
Sure. I would say the biggest thing, just because it's so relevant, is surrounding COVID. So in terms of business email compromise, we're seeing a lot of just COVID-related spam emails going out. So whether it's, I think the last one we saw, it was fresh on my head, was like COVID newsletter. It was providing kind of up-to-date on the pandemic, and it was in the form of a PDF attachment. It came from some random email address, and it actually contained the installer for a banking Trojan. So that's, really scary. And then in terms of the ransomware world, things are constantly evolving. Remote desktop still is really king here. And then third-party breaches have really seen an uptick. So we've seen a lot of attackers, they utilize what's called, I don't want to get too technical, but like a loader service. So one threat group introduces the loader service into the network, and then resells that access on the dark web for another party to then set off the ransomware and collect payment. So it's kind of 2 different threat groups, and these loader services, we've seen a massive uptick in the past 5-6 months with email. So often they were utilizing like remote desktop and third-party breaches, and I would say in the past 5 or 6 months, they've been all coming in through these email attachments. That's why email is just such a big key here.
Yeah, from what you're saying, it sounds like, still kind of human error is still one of the biggest drivers of this sort of activity. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I see some questions that I'm happy to touch on in the chat box. So the first thing is, can you share some best practices for sharing large files? So, and I see, David, you mentioned Dropbox in there. We actually use Dropbox for business. I would say the biggest factor with making it secure, and I don't want to go back to this for everything, but this is ultimately the answer for 90% of things, is multi-factor authentication. We have clients using Citrix, ShareFile, really any of the tools do the same thing. If there is a vulnerability, the only really way to get around that is to update as soon as a patch is released. So just being on top of kind of software updates. But I would say blanket MFA on any of those tooling so that you are, you cannot log into that location or you cannot receive the data that is being sent without that second layer of authentication. And then, John, we had a participant ask if these slides are going to be available. I believe so, but I'll let you respond to that.
I can certainly check with Jenna and see if we're able to distribute these, and I will circle back with Katie and Claire after.
Okay, great. And then there's another question. asking to discuss what happened with SolarWinds. How can we know if we are compromised? So that was, quite a cluster, for lack of a better term. I know that there was an injected DLL to a specific piece of software within SolarWinds. So number one, I'd make sure that you are not utilizing that specific product. And then if you are using that specific product, I know that a number of my colleagues kind of in the field and other consulting firms have been hired just to do kind of forensic work to make sure that that DLL was not present. Even if it was present, we really need some sort of network log to be able to tell if it was vulnerable in terms of, was it actually exploited, and did an attacker, utilize any of that connection? But I would start there. So are you using that specific SolarWinds product or using that specific version? And then you're probably going to have to hire a third party to take a look at the specific DLL if you're not technical. And if you are technical, there's plenty of kind of research that has been done on where to look and how to find that DLL. And then you really do need to rely on network logging to be able to tell what was exploited. Okay, John, I think that's all the questions I see in the chat window. Do you have anything on your end?
I guess maybe as an addendum to my previous, question to you, is there any specific, type of industry that is seeing this more activity than others, or is this just more broad-based? It's more just, a crime of opportunity kind of a thing?
Yeah, so there really are two distinct attack types, one being targeted and one just being purely opportunistic. We are more worried about the opportunistic just because it's way, way, way more common. And what I mean by opportunistic is that they are just scanning the World Wide Web for open RDP. So they're just looking for open ports, 3389 by default. Once they get a hit, they're setting brute force and just walking away. So they had no indication or no plan to attack that specific company. It was just purely an opportunity, or they came across a third-party breach where they're now able to get credentials for a handful of employees at a company, or they're able to do recon, whether, that's Google or LinkedIn. There's just tons of information. They know exactly kind of who to gain credentials for. Those are really where we're focused because those are scary, right? They come out of the blue and they're relatively easy to protect against. You just have to know what steps to take. Really just following through this presentation is a really, really great starting point. The targeted attacks are usually much worse, but the planning that goes into them and the time frame, we have had relatively good luck of stopping them when they are a policyholder, just from our ongoing kind of monitoring and alert that we have. But the targeted attacks, ultimately, and this is how I like to explain it to people kind of starting in the field of cyber, you can put up a door to your house, and if it is locked, and then they are able to break in, and there's another door and another door, and they're all locked, eventually they're just going to go to the next house. And if in the next house, if the front door is open, it's much easier for them to get inside. So that's a really good way to think about cyber, that these attackers, if they want to get inside your house, if they want to get in your network, ultimately they can spend a day, a month, a year, 2 years trying to get in, and eventually they probably will. But if there's somebody next door to you where, whose network is much easier to get into, there's a good chance they're going to move on. So it really is just about putting up as many doors as possible. And that's what we have found to stop the opportunistic attacks. So disabling RDP, training people on phishing, enabling MFA, utilizing password managers so people can organize their passwords and they don't reuse them. Those are the big ones. And then in terms of industry, manufacturing has definitely taken a big hit. We have had quite a few manufacturing claims, I would say, in the past few months that got hit with ransomware. So I think that was a big thing just during COVID, because they know that they can't, be put out of work. Manufacturing moves very quickly. Education has been a big thing. We've seen a lot of schools and colleges, and just throughout, I would say throughout the year, there's been a pretty big uptick in schools. But I think that is also because attackers know that their networks aren't as secure in terms of IT budgets and whatnot.
Excellent, thank you. Were there any other questions in the chat feature?
Yeah, there are 2 more popped up. So any suggestions for verifying our home routers for secure posture? It really depends what you're keeping on your home network in terms of targeted attacks. If you do not have, highly sensitive data, or you're not running a corporation, off of your home network, the chance that it's going to be breached is pretty low. But with that being said, some basic things you could do is make sure that it's patched so that the firmware and hardware is completely up to date. You change your default passwords that come with the hardware. Yeah, that's it. It really depends. I would need to understand what you're running on your network. But the biggest thing is probably just changing that password to something pretty difficult. And then any best practices you can suggest for IT audits? What are some minimum requirements we should look for? Or if we ask someone to come assess our vulnerabilities? So this also very much depends on the network and kind of what is being hosted there, how many endpoints you have. There is a tool called Netrix, so it's NETWRIX. It does Active Directory audits. I would say some of the big things that you would want them to assess are weak passwords. So just overall doing kind of a password audit, making sure that there's no passwords, out loosely on the domain. Nobody has, a text file on their desktop with all different sorts of passwords being stored. Disable any legacy accounts that are no longer in use. We call them stale accounts, but within Active Directory, if you created an account for a contractor 3 years ago and that's still an active account, delete it. Let's just get rid of it. Because if somebody is in the network, they will try to utilize those types of accounts to try to lay low. So yeah, stale accounts, weak passwords, making sure that people aren't keeping sensitive data on their desktops, that everything is kind of aggregated into a cloud platform or at least on a NAS device. So that it's in one specific location. Often we have claims where we reference it as data sprawl, but we ask the client, okay, where is your sensitive data kept? And they can't tell us. They're end users. There's no policy in place to prevent end users from saving anything anywhere they want. And that makes it not only very easy for an attacker to just aggregate data all across the network, but there is also, it makes it very difficult on a forensic perspective, because it's not in a single secured location. So that's a big one. Okay, any other questions?
I'm not seeing any more pop up on my end, but definitely if there are questions that come after the presentation, you can reach out to myself and I can route them to John and Leanne, or we can get them straight directly to both of them. I wanted to say thank you to our presenters today for giving us such a wonderful quarterly webinar. As a reminder to all of our attendees, you'll receive your PDH certificate in a follow-up email this afternoon. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.